I want to look at a video by an anarchist who is on the left wing. So I'm a right wing anarchist. I identify as an ancap. And the problem that I noticed is that a lot of the discussion about anarchism and libertarianism is that people aren't really understanding that libertarianism and anarchism is a very diverse position, and you have extremes of people on the left and on the right, and they're both anarchists, so they identify as being anarchists, meaning being anti-state, being libertarian, but other than that, they disagree on everything else. And so I want to look at left libertarians. There's a new channel that I just discovered, and it's called the Center for Anarchist Theory. Let me have a look at the channel. So this looks like it's a new channel. It's called the Center for Anarchist Theory. And it started a couple of months ago, and they have this lecture by this professor of philosophy. And it's interesting because his background seems very similar to mine in that he's teaching philosophy of language. The difference is that he had, I don't know whether he's still teaching, but he had a job in an academic career. And I suspect that's probably because he is on the left. And the interesting thing about this is that I have known a guy who's exactly like a replica of this guy. Here in Australia, there's a guy in my department who was an anarchist, and he was a friend of mine. Back then, I was politically pretty neutral, and this guy was doing his PhD on Kropotkin. Here's his book, and this is his book before he got his PhD. It's 94. I knew him in the 90s, Graham Purchase, and he wrote this book, what was it? Anarchism and Environmental Survival. So this guy was a friend of mine here in Sydney. And I could never really figure out what this is. And to this day, I don't understand left-wing anarchism and what it is that they want. For example, Noam Chomsky, he identifies or has identified at some stage as an anarchist. I think the technical term is Anarcho-Syndicalism, and you can see this here. Purchase talks about Anarcho-Syndicalism. And let's just have a look very quickly at what ChatGPT says about left-wing anarchism. So left-wing anarchism, often referred to as social anarchism, encompasses a range of ideologies united by shared opposition to hierarchical authority, economic exploitation, and centralized power. So they're against hierarchy, authority, economic exploitation, so they're against capitalism and against centralized power. So they oppose all forms of hierarchy, deemed unjustified, including capitalism, the state, patriarchy, racism. So they're against private property. And this is the problem already, because how do they decide how resources are utilized and goods are distributed? What is their model for economic distribution, right? Which is the basic problem of economics. allocation of resources and distribution of goods. Next, they advocate for horizontal, non-hierarchical relationships in all areas of life, emphasizing cooperation over competition. Decentralization. Political and economic systems should be organized on a decentralized basis with decision-making power rooted in local communities and workplaces. So they're localist and decentralized, which I think in this respect, they're in agreement with right libertarians. In other words, right libertarians do argue for secession and decentralization and localism as far as is feasible. So right libertarians like me, who are, I guess, Austro-libertarians economically, agree that you want to decentralize as much as possible, but it depends on the situation, on the particular thing that you're talking about, how much decentralization is feasible. So it's not because, maximally decentralized is just individualism, right? Mutual aid. So my friend Graham Purchase talked about mutual aid a lot because he was interested in Peter Kropotkin, who was a Russian prince. Inspired by Peter Kropotkin's work, mutual aid emphasizes cooperation and solidarity as the basis for societal organization rather than competition. And the problem is that from an economic point of view, the problem with this is that you need competition in order to allocate resources and have some kind of a system of distribution. In other words, without competition, you don't really have prices, you don't have, because there's scarcity, right? You have, we assume that there's no problem in a situation of abundance. Without scarcity, there's no problem. There's no competition. So you can't have scarcity and no competition. If there's abundance, if there's no scarcity, then okay, there's no competition. But as soon as you have scarcity, you will have different people competing for resources. You will have some kind of conflict, and you need a system for resolving this conflict. And economic competition is one such system. So competition prices is a system for distributing resources and allocating resources. See here, collective ownership. This is what makes them leftist, is that they believe in collective ownership. Left-wing anarchists reject private ownership of the means of production. Instead, they promote collective or communal ownership and management of resources and industries. You see, within the right-wing Austro-libertarian type of anarchism, that's not possible because without private property, you don't have prices. And without prices, you can't do cost accounting and allocation of resources. You're basically guessing. And this is the explanation for why communism has failed, because there was no way of figuring out what is the optimal way of allocating resources. It was all guesswork, essentially. And you can't run a complex economy in that way. And without a price system as an information signaling system, allocation of resources is all but impossible. And you end up with shortages in some areas and oversupply in other areas. You will have a shortage of timber or oversupply of nails. You have all kinds of things that were actually experienced in socialist countries So, for example, in my previous video, I was talking about the oversupply of people with university education. And my argument is that if the price system was in operation, there would be that's a signaling system where which kinds of skills are in demand. So if the prices for certain occupations are relatively high, people will be drawn toward those occupations. Whereas if prices for other occupations are relatively low, people would move away from those occupations. And so if there are people who can't get jobs or are underpaid or underemployed, that means that they've invested in skills which are not in demand. And so the question is, how did that happen? And the right-wing libertarian explanation, the Austro-libertarian explanation, is that the price signaling system was in some way, the market was distorted because there was funding provided in some way. Money was allocated centrally in a way that gave people the wrong information about what is in demand. People were told that university education of a particular kind was in demand on the market, right? They were told to participate in the knowledge economy, however that's defined, and it turns out that that economy actually doesn't exist. There's no demand for that. Maybe the knowledge economy in some other sense exists, okay? But in a particular sense that the central planners of the state were signaling and were funding, promoting, they were funding advertising, they were funding university courses, they were providing funding, which gave people the wrong idea. If people were participating in the market and they were looking at the actual situation, they would have to make a decision and take a risk. And then if that doesn't work out, they took that risk, right? But the state in various ways incentivized them, and they got the wrong idea. That's a kind of an Austro-libertarian explanation of how and why that happened. So to go back to the original point, without private property, and you have no prices, and without prices, you have no system for allocating resources like education, or in your own case, right, your resource is your time, your energy to learn a skill, and then you're putting yourself on the market to sell that skill. And so you have to decide when you're starting out in the education system, whether you're gaining skills that are actually in demand and will gain you a higher salary. Okay, direct action. Change should come from so this is back to the left libertarians, left anarchists. Change should come from direct grassroots action rather than relying on electoral politics or institutional reforms. Examples include protests, strikes, and establishment of self-managed economies. So I think this is what people like Chomsky and Graham Purchase mean by anarcho-syndicalism, is that they form groups like unions or other kinds of groups which create social, I guess you could call it social disquiet. I mean, they start throwing soup at paintings in art galleries, and they glue their hands to the road in front of traffic. And this is obviously anti-private property. They have no respect for private property. So this is completely antithetical to right-wing libertarianism, like or right-wing anarchism, anarcho-capitalism, okay? Because they are engaging in activity that is impinging on and I guess you could say they're engaging in an activity that does not respect the private property of other people, right? You're driving your car and then there's a protester there, and now, the assumption that there's, they don't own the road, they don't own your car, okay? They're engaging in an activity. It's like, they just like a thief comes into your house and starts taking stuff. As it's your house, it's your stuff. They just start taking it. They're pretty much doing the same thing because they don't own the road, right? Now, I'm not saying the road is privately owned, it's owned publicly, but what they're doing is against whoever's, however you define the ownership of the road. What they're doing is against the will of the public owners of that road, right? Same with art galleries, right? They don't own the art gallery, they don't own the painting, and they are damaging property that they don't own, and they have no right to do that. So these people, and it's amazing that this is socially tolerated, at all. Okay. Goals. What are their goals? So they want a stateless society. And the question is, how do you define a stateless society? The ultimate goal is the abolition of the state as it is seen as an institution of coercion, oppression, and exploitation. So right-wing libertarians and anarcho-capitalists agree with that. But I think the way that they view this is different, right? Economic equality, replace capitalism with systems of economic organization based on equality, cooperation, and the satisfaction of human needs, such as anarcho-communism or participatory economics. So you see, how do you base your economic organization on equality without the state? This is the question. So you don't have private property and you don't have the state, but you're going to have to impose equality and impose cooperation, right? Because the assumption is on the right that there is scarcity. So there is inherent competition for resources. Sorry, I didn't show you. This is what I'm reading. So let's read this again. So the goal is the abolition of the state as it is seen as an institution of coercion, oppression, and exploitation, and replacing capitalism with systems of economic organization based on equality, cooperation, and the satisfaction of human needs, such as anarcho-communism or participatory economics. And these goals seem quite incompatible, as I said, because there is a scarcity. As you see, without scarcity, there would be no need for economics. There would be no need for a system of allocating resources and prices and stuff. You could just do whatever you want, and it wouldn't interfere with anyone else. So the only way to do that is some kind of democracy, and democracy means that you now have to have voting, and then some people will not be satisfied. So let's go back to this. So they're talking about social liberty and autonomy, create a society where individuals and communities are free to determine their own lives without coercion or external control. You see, that's not, according to anarcho-capitalists, that's not possible, right? As soon as you require equality, cooperation, and satisfaction, right, you're gonna have to now limit people's freedom because of scarcity. Social justice, address and dismantle systemic inequalities related to class, gender, race. Well, now you're going against human nature. People will always divide into classes, genders, race, and so on. and there will always be kind of a natural hierarchy. And if you try to stop that, then you're going to then people will feel oppressed. Sustainable living and so on. Okay, so this looks like just more of the same. So let's have a look at the video by the professor.
So hi everyone, please join me in welcoming Mark Lentz. They are a professor of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy and the Program of Peace and Justice at Georgetown University. Or I guess it's Professor Emeritus now. Well, thanks for coming to talk with us, Mark.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Yeah, if anybody wanted to like put their camera on, I'd love to see your faces, but obviously you don't have to.
Yes,
okay, so since you were calling your group this Anarchist Theory
anarchist
organization, I thought I'd just be contentious and give you a talk against theory, because I'm very serious about this. I don't think the best way to forward anarchist adjacent politics is through anarchist theory. And I want to kind of explain why quickly. I'm going to start with a kind of a little story, true story, that I'll just leave in the background for you to think about as I go through this. So yeah, I was a professor in the philosophy department at Georgetown for, I don't know, 35 years or something like that. I got incredibly lucky in my academic career, not just at getting a job and getting a good job, but falling into a department where people listened to one another, made arguments, talked about issues, and followed the argument where it led. Over the course of those 35 years, I counted. So officially, right, the procedures for any decision in the department was to vote, right? A typical departmental thing. Over those 35 years, I think there were about 5 total votes that were not unanimous.
So what he's saying here is that in his department, which is, they just get money. They get the money out from the government, from the students who take out massive loans, from endowments. They have this philosophy department, and they have to vote on issues like who to hire. And this is his example of anarcho-communism or anarcho-syndicalism, where they discuss and they do this kind of Socratic philosophical debate, and then they vote, and they're like 90% of the time, it's unanimous. They persuade each other. So you have these fat cat philosophers, philosophy professors, who don't have to really do anything other than a bit of admin, read some student papers, and then they just give their lectures in philosophy. And this is the model for how we're supposed to run society, like factories, farms, oil rigs. It needs to be by voting and argumentation. It's so interesting how these people really academics live in a fantasy world. And the problem is that these people, they have influence, they have real influence, and they create the whole throwing soup at Van Gogh paintings and gluing your hands to the street phenomenon. They act, they live in this fantasy world. I mean, look at this guy. I mean, he is like a cliche of an anarchist philosophy professor. And I think he's a really nice person. And I can tell you that my friend Graham Purchase is a very nice guy. Okay. The problem is the idea that they live in a completely insulated bubble. And then they have these students over a period of several years, during which they stuff these students' heads with all these completely unrealistic ideas, whereby then the result, the product of this is cans of soup on Van Gogh paintings in art galleries. And you wonder how that happens. This is how it happens. This guy, he's a very nice guy, very congenial, very, really agreeable, like really agreeable guy, and very persuasive, right? He will say, look, we vote in our department and we agree. Why can't the whole of society be like a philosophy department full of, and we have Catholics. Let me just go on a bit further.
And the reason was that people talked about shit until it became clear what the best thing to do was. And then everyone did it, whether they walked in initially with the idea that that was a good thing or not, or whether it was in their interest or not. Everyone took each other seriously. This is very rare in academia. I had another colleague who was in one of our meetings once pull me from another department, pull me aside and say, "Is this normal?" And I said, "What do you mean?" She said, "Well, everyone listened to each other and took each other seriously and revised their views when there were arguments." I was like, "Yeah." She just said, "Can I change to your department?" Anyway, the specific story is that there was one time when there was an actually contentious vote. It was a hiring decision. So first of all, the kind of decision where you either got to hire this person or not hire this person. There's not really any sort of compromise in between on that. One part of the department felt very strongly this was the right person to hire. Another part of the department felt very strongly that it wasn't the right person to hire. And we talked it through and we argued. It must have gone for like 3 hours. And very few people had their opinion changed. We were kind of at this deadline. So finally the chair's like, well, okay, let's vote, because that's what we do. So we voted, and it was, I don't know, sort of like 17-13 in favor of hiring them. And we were proceeding to get up and leave, report this to the dean. And a person on the winning side of the vote said, "Wait a minute, I'm really uncomfortable with this. This isn't what we do. We don't have split decisions like this. And I really feel like I'm really worried that the minority is getting bullied here." And the person who had been the most vociferous person on the losing side of the vote said, "No, absolutely not. You all listened to my arguments all through this whole thing. Everybody considered everything. We haven't come to an agreement. The only rational thing for us to do is to go with what the majority wants here." So there was consensus on going with not consensus. I'll just leave that there. Again, that was a group, this is a philosophy department, right? I mean, good, respectful people. Certainly at that time, there was exactly one of us who thought of ourselves as an anarchist. There may be two now, vaguely, depending on how you define it. People ranged from leftist politics to liberal politics to kind of conservative Catholic politics in the department. Consensus decision-making was not part of the ideology of the department. Okay, just keep that in the back of your mind for a second. So I take anarchism to be an approach to social and political organization. It's an account of essentially a commitment to building human society through non-hierarchical means. Exactly what we mean by that, one can talk about. But in order to organize society through...
Well, you see, he's already contradicting himself in so many different ways, because, well, first of all, you can see that you're going to have disagreement. And voting is one way of doing it. But, well, if you're on the right, if you're an ancap, people vote when they buy things. When I buy something, I'm voting. I'm voting with my money. And that is, in a complex society, the emergent order is from millions of transactions that then allocate resources which is, the assumption is that's an optimal way of allocating resources, because people, when they buy things, they signal what they want and how much they want. And voting of this kind can work in the philosophy department, but it's not going to be a system for example, the question of economics, like guns versus butter, right? Or how much butter, what kind of butter, the specific quality of the butter. You can't do that by voting, right? And then the hierarchy issue, well, philosophy professors, how non-hierarchical is that? I mean, they're getting paid, they're teaching, they have high status, well-paid jobs, easy, right? How is which part of it is the non-hierarchical part? You're a professor, you have a PhD, you have a title, you're the teacher, the students are, just listening to you. You speak, they listen. The students are divided into cohorts by year, which means you have first year students, in the US it's going to be called sophomore, whatever. I don't understand the terminology. We say first year, second, third year, right? So they're already organized depending on how many years, right, and which subjects they've passed before they can go on to the next subject. Everything is organized and hierarchical from beginning to end. There's nothing non-hierarchical. The non-hierarchical part in his life that he's living, that he thinks is completely in his imagination. This is apart from the fact that the university within society is such a high status, basically the knowledge dispensing institution. If he tried to teach his stuff outside of the university, he would have a very hard time. Being in a university with all the clout, all the power of the university system, right, where basically you are privileged and paid to stand there and tell people what to think and how to think. The privileges are just, it is just multiple layers of privilege. Despite his crappy kind of room here and cheap furniture, this guy is privileged up to his eyeballs. But he won't admit it. He will say, I'm an anarchist, I'm a communist, I'm into equality. The level of delusion of academics is just enormous, amazing, mind-boggling.
Non-hierarchical means consistently, you require the meaningful participation of essentially all people, right? People have to be engaged in the decisions that affect them.
Right? Meaningful participation in decisions. I mean, I'm sure that there's been, I'm in education, right? In particular language education, and they're trying these experiments where the students participate meaningfully in the decision making about the syllabus, right? And none of it is ever put into real practice. They have these experiments, they try like self-study, independent study, all these kind of lefty experiments. None of it goes anywhere. Now, I'm not against it. I think that is the way to go. But the problem is that they're trying to turn the university into that. And that's why you have all these protests at universities, these academics who are kind of in this university straitjacket where they're in this incredibly hierarchical and regulated system, but they're teaching everything like against the idea. So the only thing they can do is to kind of work up the students to be activists and to protest and find something to protest about. And so you're meaningfully participating in society. But if you actually did that, you would just dismantle the university. Because the university is, and all schooling of this kind is inherently hierarchical and authoritarian and regulated, and it's just by its very nature. You need a syllabus that you have to deliver. If you try to do it democratically, the whole thing just crashes down. And you can see this in all kinds of, for example, I mean, the whole thing is what's been happening in California with the fires. Everybody knows that, okay, there were some fires, but the extent of the damage and the complete inability of the fire service to do anything about it, right? To basically save, okay, the fire started and some homes would have been burned, but they couldn't do anything to try to reduce the damage. It was just basically completely out of control. And everybody knows, or should know, that it's completely the result of DEI, where instead of thinking about competently training people, making people competent in a job, and the competence went out the window. Instead, we're going to negotiate equality. We're going to do the democratic thing. We're going to worry about people's feelings, and we want unanimous this, unanimous that, right? When you start doing that, the whole thing just crashes down. And the opposite of that is a completely free market system, whether it's for firefighting and security, right? Because in California, it's controlled by the state, and the state started regulating the insurance industry, so the insurance companies just went away. But you could just completely privatize everything, including insurance, deregulate and privatize, and then you would have a private company paid by the insurance company to deal with fires. And similarly, in a university, you would have completely privatized education system, and people choose which courses they take and how they take it, and they choose the price that is, suitable for them, right? But neither in firefighting insurance on one hand and in education on the other do you have a private enterprise system. You have these universities that are obviously insulated from market forces that have endowments, the students pay huge fees that they have to take out bank loans, right, for. This whole system is completely insulated from market forces. But I think that the privatization of education is inevitable. And that's the alternative to what he's talking about. And it's the true participatory system, is the market system, the completely free market system, which is going to come through in the form of online education. It's just inevitable, because the universities have become so decrepit and so insulated, and you get this kind of thing where this guy is talking. He's a philosopher, but he can't even think clearly through the kind of the logical inconsistencies of what he's saying.
They have to have a say in those decisions. They can't be just simply, even if that say is, you know more about X than I do. Like, it's a famous quote of Bakunin where he says, "Reject authority? Of course not. Farthest thing from my mind. When I buy a pair of shoes, I respect the authority of the shoemaker. When I do this, and he says, it's my choice to figure out who I take to be knowledgeable and wise, and my choice whether to follow them." Okay.
Yeah, okay, I agree with that. Yeah, it's a free enterprise system, but you're rejecting private property, and you're rejecting the free enterprise system. So how's that supposed to work?
Okay. So, But the main point is you can't just have good people in charge making the decisions in the interests of everyone else. That's sort of contrary to the whole spirit of the project. Meaningful participation is my sort of second main premise, is that meaningful participation requires us to develop skills of interacting with one another rationally, with respect. I would even say, if you understand this word correctly, with love.
Yeah. This is a big thing among the left, including these, is re-education. You need to learn certain skills. And this is essentially social engineering. What they're proposing is social engineering. What they want is they want to re-educate society so they want schooling, and basically it's going to be compulsory. Because the thing is, unless you recognize the need for being re-educated in love and respect and being a nice person, then you're not going to do it. If you're not a nice person, you're going to say, well, I don't need this. So how are you going to... So what they want is they want enforced re-education. That's the only practical way to do it, right? There's no other way to do it other than forcing people to be re-educated, to be nice.
It isn't a matter of writing down a bunch of rules. I sent along a paper you could have a look at with some arguments for why rules are never sufficient for having, meaningful participatory democratic participation. But I think the example of my philosophy department is one where there are absolutely no rules pushing toward consensus, but we always got there.
A bunch of people with philosophy PhDs who are basically hired because they are nice, right? Why I never got a job in academia? I'm not really nice. I'm argumentative, right? I'm hard-headed. I don't take BS. I want people to give me proper, well-thought-out arguments. I don't buy just... So I'm not nice. So I don't belong. You see, well, when they're voting on, that's exactly how it works. That's how it worked in my department. I sat through those votes and those discussions, and there are a number of criteria for hiring, but generally, yeah, you've got to be nice. So they have these acceptable personality types that you're either nice or you are of certain ethnicities. It's virtually never because you are hard-headed and kind of an intellectual type that's not agreeable, right? Agreeableness is kind of a desirable characteristic. So these people are pre-selected for being agreeable. Okay. I mean, I don't know whether they're actually agreeable to begin with, but they figure out, well, if I want a philosophy job in a university job, I better be agreeable. So that's why you see these guys who these IQ researchers, they won the Nobel Peace Prize, and they got to a high level before agreeableness became a requirement, and they're still living in like the 70s, and they just say, oh, IQ is this or IQ is that, and they just get crushed. You see, they evolved in the previous era, of intellectual dinosaurs, and they stepped into the modern world of the woke professor, and they said something in public and they just got crushed because it's no longer acceptable to be a disagreeable, hard-headed intellectual type. You have to be agreeable. So all these people are pre-selected, and now that is the model for left anarchist society. Very nice. I like it.
There. And the skills this is a skill. Yeah.
Yeah. So you see the dinosaurs, in the intellectual dinosaurs, they just lack the skills. If they say that, these people are this IQ and that people are that IQ, or they mention this, women are this or women are that, that's lacking these basic skills of being agreeable that you need in civilized society. It doesn't matter if you're a Nobel Prize winning researcher, it doesn't matter if you've cured cancer, or and the same thing with to go back to California fires. They were saying, well, if you are this a woman and you don't have you're not strong enough to carry the man out, and she goes, well, he shouldn't be there in the first place. What is important is equity and niceness and agreeableness. And if you're in a fire and you need to be carried out, but the firefighter is an equitable, agreeable woman who is not strong enough to carry you out, it's your fault. You see, you need the skills. You need you've got to have the skills to vote and discuss and engage in Socratic questioning and persuade. Is the fire, is the fire agreeable or disagreeable? Should we attack the fire? You've got to, stand, in a group, and you've got to have a discussion and vote. Should we go in, or should we just let the fire, keep going? Because it's, global warming or something. And that's just, these people, they didn't do enough for the environment. They're rich, they're rich, and they're living in this rich area. And obviously, climate change gods decided that they need to go. Let's vote. Yeah, so you've got to practice it.
Skillful of the thing by practicing it.
You've got to practice
training and being guided.
You've got to be practiced, right? So rather than practicing drills on fire, putting out fires, that's not really that important. That's putting the priorities in the wrong place, right? So in a dinosaur age, firefighters would be men, and they would be practicing putting out fires and going into the fires. But in the new DEI, equitable, anarchic world, you've got to practice discussing and reaching consensus and meaningful participation. Because when there's a fire, you need to meaningfully participate. Let's say you're told to go into the fire and carry out the fat man who's burning alive, but you need to meaningfully participate in that decision. That is more important. And so that's what we need to practice. We need to practice meaningful participation in the decision making as to whether to go into the fire and carry out the big slob who's stuck on his couch burning alive.
Did by others who are more skillful than you. Okay, that's a short little sort of three-premise argument. What does participatory horizontal organization look like? It's easy to say really generic things like everybody's taken seriously, no one dominates. But specifically, to get to specifics around it is much harder. First of all, there are massive differences across context. The issues that arise in making collective decisions in a steel mill are very different than those that arise in a philosophy department, to say nothing of, an army.
You got that right, yeah.
When we begin to build,
okay,
and when we begin to
we're
build
making
necessary
progress.
larger scale structures, ones that might connect a participatory group in Columbus to one in DC, for example, things are even more complicated. We can't bring 1 million people together in a seminar room and have a nice discussion. So what sorts of representation are called for? I'm going to plug an old book here that looks at the way this worked in detail in revolutionary Catalonia from 1900 to 1930. It was a book by Murray Bookchin called Spanish Anarchists, the Heroic Years. And what's fascinating about it is how complicated it was. Everyone had a sort of ideology, but when that ideology met reality, how do we connect the issues of isolated farmers with those of people working in a factory, with women, with queers? It's extraordinary, some of the issues that people were dealing with in 1920s Spain. They had to make shit up on the fly in complicated contextual ways that, importantly, I don't think anyone could have seen coming ahead of time. Anyway, I urge you to take a look at that book at some point. I think, even though it's kind of just a history, I think it's an enormously useful one. And more equally importantly, as we get closer to implementing non-hierarchical organization in many of these different domains of life, the contexts in which we're building it are going to change. Some are going to disappear. We aren't going to have cops or a standing military in an anarchist society. I take that much as at least clear. And
what about firefighters? Are we going to have firefighters? We're not going to have cops. You see, because the criminals, we're going to educate them to be nice. You see, that's the idea, is that the criminals, they have psychological problems, and we'll have social workers who will teach the criminals and the rapists and the murderers and drug traffickers and all these people. They just need to be nice. They need to learn communication skills. They need to learn to engage in meaningful participation, right? And if you look at American cities that are run by Democrats, that's what they are basically working on. They're all labs, experimental labs in meaningful participation. Okay, and if your shoe shop gets robbed by these people, well, you have to think. The problem is you were engaging in private property. What you should have done is you needed to engage with these people. They're just expressing their meaningful participation. I guess is that there's no cops, right? There's no cops. We're not going to have cops in an anarchic society. So you have this anarchy. People just loot, steal, and then shops have everything is behind in these plastic boxes, and you have to ask the person to come and open the box so you can get the product. Well, that's an alternative to cops. You don't have cops. You just have boxes. And there was one story about this guy. He had a shoe shop. He was South American immigrant in California, I guess. And he just packs up he only has one shoe. So the right shoe for every pair. So the criminals charged into his store, and they couldn't get anything because every shoe is just one side. No cops, right? That's a solution. I like it. It's good.
Others are going to be radically transformed. I do think we'll have universities. I think we'll have people who spend their time thinking and teaching, but boy, will they look different. As Amy was talking about some of the leadership of universities. Now, we all know that universities have been rapidly corporatizing over the last 20 years from a beginning that was certainly not radical to start with, but at least was far more inclusive and participatory, say 30 or 40 years ago than it is now. That'll all change radically, even if we have the thing. What will a family look like when it's freed from the constraints of capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and all of the authoritarian reflexes that all of us have been brought up with? My claim is,
you see, it's reflexes. So it's this kind of we have these reflexes, but we've been brought up with them. So we learned them, and we need to unlearn them. So these reflexes are not in some way innate or natural. They're reflexes, but we've been brought up with them. So this is going back to the, like we learn this bad behavior, and we need to learn this meaningfully participatory communication, all of which is pure fantasy and projection, right?
It's just not just that we don't know the answer to those questions, but that we're not in a good epistemic position to consider them, or at least not as good a position as the people a generation after us will be, right? I mean, we have all been trained by a world in which most of the formal structures are hierarchically organized.
Right. And Nima Parvini talks about the boomer truth, what's the word that he uses? Regime, the boomer truth regime. And this is the boomer truth regime. Yeah. So boomers, this guy, I'm guessing he's a boomer, or he's older than me. He's by 20 years. So I'm guessing he grew up he was, when in the 60s and 70s. That's the boomer. And they created this kind of ideology, the hippie ideology, that you can have, that it's all, society is hierarchical, society teaches people to be, to behave badly. And we need to re-educate them in these universities, and it's all voluntary. The idea is that outside of capitalism and outside of this patriarchy and hierarchy, people are fundamentally nice. That's the claim. People are fundamentally nice, and you just have to kind of reach deep inside of them. Like if they're looting, if they're killing, they're, doing all this bad stuff, it's because they've been oppressed. It's because there's scarcity. But in the boomer truth regime, there is no scarcity. We are living in abundance. Now, the boomer doesn't see that the abundance is created by capitalism and private property. He just takes it for granted because he's a fat cat professor in a university. He doesn't understand how the system works, and that without private property, the whole thing would collapse and there would be starvation. So he is basically living in a fantasy, and he's got a pulpit with young minds where he is going to brainwash them into this boomer truth regime. Yeah, exactly.
Theme in anarchist thinking from the early 20th century, at least, that what we're trying to do is build a world which can raise people who will know more about how to build a world than we do. And that means that it's precisely misguided to lay down a theory about how all that's going to go ahead of time. There's lots and lots of letters from the Spanish anarchists criticizing the Soviet Marxists on precisely these grounds. It's like, what do you mean you're going to lay out the blueprint for the fucking revolution? You guys don't even know what the issues of the revolution will be. And there are obviously more famous issues, but in some ways, I think this kind of experimentalist, pragmatic, anti-doctrinal dimension marks one of the deepest divisions between the Marxist tradition and the anarchist tradition. There's also many connections between those traditions, of course, as well. Okay, so if that's right, that we're not in a position to figure out what the ultimate goal of revolutionary change is, and B, we're not going to get better at it by writing theories, then, how do we get there? Well, we get there gradually in a kind of, I hate this word, dialectical process, by building gradually richer, more epistemically authoritative practices that will then be in a position to see what was wrong with the practices we built. So in a weird way, I want to claim that, I mean, there's different things you can mean by revolution. If anarchism is certainly revolutionary in the sense that it wants to be radical, it wants to challenge some of the deepest organizing principles of our.
Okay, I'm going to finish there. So he wants to do this. He thinks there's no kind of theory or you can't predict it. You got to basically do these experiments, and then the experiments will give you epistemic authority. So you build a commune, right? And then like a kibbutz, and then you experiment, and then you see how that works, right? And are people nice? The problem is that all of that's been done over and over and over. And the ancap position is that society naturally gravitates toward a private property, free enterprise system as the best way of allocating resources and distributing goods, right? In other words, it's the best system for solving the problem of scarcity. If there's no scarcity, then there's no problem. Then you don't need economics, just everyone's happy, there's no competition. But because there is scarcity and there are more wants than what is available, there is going to be competition. And when there's competition, you need a system for allocating resources. You need and for that you need prices. And without private property, you don't have any of that. And so money and private property evolved through experimentation, and the free market system has won out as the best way of doing it. And then the state emerged as a way of plundering the wealth created by the free enterprise, free voluntary exchange, private property system. And this always leads to a reduction in living standards beyond what would be available if the system was fully free market, free enterprise system. So any effort, any system that upsets the free market voluntary exchange system leads to a reduction in living standards and the productivity of the economy. And that is proven beyond any means. It's basically it's a naturally evolved system. And he wants to try to evolve, do these experiments. None of that will work because already all of that has been done. And the free market, free enterprise, private property system is the best way of dealing with scarcity. And unless you recognize scarcity, and you're not living in reality. And once you recognize the scarcity as a fact, then you recognize that you need private property in order to have prices, and you need prices in order to have the optimal allocation of resources.